What I want to do in this lesson is take an introduction to conservatism, the next of our major political ideas that we're going to be studying. We finished the last lesson by thinking about the sort of bridge between the neoliberal and the conservative, sort of talking about how neoliberalism is quite heavily influenced and or is is influencing a number of different conservative thoughts and ideas. Well, we touched on some basic ideas of conservatism in that video. This lesson and the next few lessons is going to explore various different types of conservatism, the origins of conservatism, and the various core ideas, social ideas, economic ideas relating to conservatism. So essentially, conservatism, one of the things that conservatism is almost defined as, and could be defined as, at least in terms of its origins, is almost a reaction to radical political change. Okay, so it comes out of and can be seen first when we start to look at the revolutions of Europe and the revolutions of America, and specifically not necessarily the revolutions themselves, because they can be represented as the radical political change, more so the reactions to these revolutions. And so this really does tie into the origins of conservatism, because the concept of conservatism began to take shape following specifically the French Revolution, although some may argue, and some will argue, and we will talk about some philosophers who had influenced conservatism earlier than the French Revolution. We'll talk about Thomas Hobbes in a minute. But ultimately, the French Revolution, the purpose of the French Revolution was the replacing of the monarchy with a written constitution, at least to an extent, at least at the beginning, but we then get quite a significant terror that begins to take shape within France during this period as well. Your understanding of the history is not necessarily that important, although we do have a series of lessons on the French Revolution for A-level students, for A-level history students, if you want to have a look. But ultimately, like it says here, the purpose is to replace the monarchy with a written constitution. And so with this, the reaction to the radical political change that was the French Revolution is the promotion of ideas such as that of the change to conserve principle. And this really brings into question the work of Edmund Burke, who is arguably one of the earliest conservative thinkers who contributed so significantly to conservative political thought. He wrote a treatise on the evils of revolution, which is a book that is I would recommend for any political philosophy student. And he says that a state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation. So ultimately, what Edmund Burke is talking about is that the idea of conserving, the idea of being able to conserve traditional concepts of institutions, of political thought, political ideas, economic ideas, social ideas, is inherently required, or at least inherently requires the ability for a state to have some kind of means of change. This is where we get the idea of changing to conserve. As opposed to liberal thinkers, conservatives would believe that human nature is limited and also and inherently very flawed. If you remember back to when we looked at human nature for liberals and how people like John Locke understood human nature, we had a much more positive understanding of what human nature essentially is. The idea that if we lived in a state of nature, things would be quite tolerable. We would be able to exercise our natural rights and our natural freedoms, and where conflicts break out, humans would be naturally individualistic in their goals and their aims, but also would be reticent to the beliefs and the understandings of others, such that social contracts may exist. This is something that is opposed by conservative thought. Conservatives believe that human nature is limited and flawed, and this is where we can then go to a pre-conservative philosopher, which is that of Thomas Hobbes. It would be incorrect to call Thomas Hobbes a conservative, because Thomas Hobbes was somebody who was writing before conservatism came into existence. But he is somebody who, if he was writing 100 or 200 years later, would actually definitely be considered to be a conservative. Thomas Hobbes would take a skeptical view of human nature and his understanding of the state of nature. So, as we've already mentioned, we looked at Hobbes in previous lessons when we compared his understanding of the state of nature to that of John Locke. But let's look at his political philosophy in more detail here. Thomas Hobbes would be writing during the period of the English Civil War. He would be writing, the English Civil War, by the way, existed between around 1642 to 1651. So a good few hundred years, or a good 100 years or so before the French Revolution. And his political philosophy is informed by his opinions of the English Civil War. You can't understand Hobbesian political thought, you can't understand his magnum opus, Leviathan, without having an understanding of the context and the history in which it was written. It was written in response to and during the English Civil War and the troubles of the calamitous 17th century. Ultimately, Hobbes argued against the conceptualization of a state of nature, a state without a sovereign, a state without, or a society without a sovereign, a state without, or a society without a state, should I say. He argued that the state of nature would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Concluding, therefore, that the only alternative is, given the fact that a state of nature would be so intolerable, that a subjection to an autocratic sovereign is something that is required for the establishment of order and the establishment of a tolerable society. Hobbes argued that the state of nature would be similar, it would be akin to the state of war, due to the individual's natural selfish desires for power, and therefore informing their understanding of human nature.